Hey, what's up, YouTube? It's Richie from Boston. Today's the 5th of February, 2017, and believe it or not, I'm over here at the Young Turks YouTube website. Now, Young Turks has over 3 million subscribers, and I remember when they were a small channel and they were just coming up. But in this video right here that's got 190,000 views, they put it up about 5 months ago, you have this guy yammering on and talking about chemtrails, except he's putting the spin on it that it's ludicrous. It's the most ridiculous idea ever. Now, with the resources available to this channel, I can't imagine they don't have the actual truth. They're out there talking about evaporating white lines in the sky, and the government's probably spraying Viagra and so forth and so on and blah, blah, blah. Now, let me tell you something. These guys have an enormous reach. They started out under the guise as a liberal truth-telling channel, much like Alex Jones did. The only problem is they have surpassed Alex Jones in viewership by a lot. Now, I'd like to retort to the Young Turks right here with some actual facts. They claim there's no backup, there's no basis, and there's no scientific fact to prove that climate change and chemtrails are hand in hand. So let me show you what they refuse to show their subscribers, and maybe you guys might want to hop over there and give them some more thumbs down, because right now it's about 60-40. And it's still in favor of the article, which is totally false, and it's doing an enormous disservice to humanity because we're all breathing this shit in. Stand by. Let's start with the visual proof. Do you see this airplane turning on and off the chemicals that are spraying out of the back nozzles that you can clearly see on the airplane? And yes, they also put the nozzles right inside the turbine housing. Now, if your eyes are lying to you, apparently that plane is simply gliding along. It's no longer under power. And if maybe the Young Turks aren't familiar with the Appleman chart that came out by NASA that showed the conditions that are conducive to causing chemtrails or contrails, evaporating water trails, are 1,000,000 to 1. There has to be an exact certain type of atmosphere going on for airplanes to suddenly show up, start spraying and blocking out the sun and the sun only. Yes, I did pause so you can just watch this plane turn on and off its sprayers. It's being followed by another airplane that doesn't obviously know it's there or care that it's there, because chemtrails are just some crazy conspiracy like the government. Let's take a look at the insides of these airplanes that are clearly and obviously outfitted for spraying the atmosphere. It's pretty extensive. Those aren't passengers, those are tanks, and they're individual tanks, so they can be filled with barium, strontium, aluminum, and other solar remediation chemicals. Because yes, solar remediation is a thing, and it's a thing that our government claims it could do to fight global warming, but of course it does not. These aren't passengers. Do you see what I'm saying, Young Turks? Yeah, you see that? Those aren't people or cargo. It's apparatus to fill with liquid metals to spray in the atmosphere. Using something like Flight Radar 24, one can easily track airplanes as they have no call signs and they're spraying the atmosphere. And yes, commercial jets can also be outfitted so they can do it as well. And there's more. But according to Young Turks, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Don't believe those lying eyes of yours. And it just continues to go on and on. Many of these photos, many of these videos were put forth by airline pilots, military personnel, people that actually care about the environment and don't care what their sponsors on YouTube say. You see, when you reach over 3 million subscribers, that means you've played the game perfectly and you've done exactly what your sponsors want you to do. You see, Richie from Boston has a hard time holding on to any sponsorship because I cover things like chemtrails, governmental conspiracies that actually have basis in fact. I covered things like how Israel should not be a state whatsoever. I don't jump on the bandwagon when somebody becomes president and suddenly now he'll make a difference. You see what I'm saying? Exactly. Exactly. Now let's listen to some more, I guess, conspiratorial proof from David Keith, who was part of Obama's weather force, a top scientist for the United States government.
The little picture is from a nanofabrication study, which shows you can make very high quality, and do this in just a jet in a very simple way, make high quality aluminum particles just by spraying aluminum vapor out, which oxidizes. So it's certainly in principle possible to do that, and there's a big literature that's already looked at that. And you could do that by either building new versions of these aircraft or even re-engineering existing aircraft. So there's some ideas that, so you go to an engineering firm and you want this done. They don't say this is hard or unusual. They say, okay, yes, we could do it. Aerosol geoengineering looks like it is so cheap that the cost is basically not going to be an issue. That means that implementation decisions will be risk-to-risk decisions. The risk of doing it against the risk of not doing it. And it makes the problem of how we govern it fundamentally harder and different and novel. So I've told you that it's cheap to deliver materials to the stratosphere, and I'm convinced that's true. I don't think that will change. But I think the more we do research, the less easy this will look, the more complicated the environmental effects will look. And that's a good thing, because right now it looks too easy. So I think that if we do more research, we're likely to find out that it's harder and more complicated than we thought, and the side effects are harder to manage, and that's a healthy outcome that will make it easier to do the management. Of course, the opposite reaction is possible. It's an empirical question, how people will actually react to knowledge about this. Another reaction is to say, if these crazy scientists are so concerned about putting CO2 in the atmosphere, they want to think about these things, then that might actually mean we should be more serious about the risks of CO2 in the atmosphere. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard. It's more like free riding on our grandkids. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard. It's more like free riding on our grandkids.
Numerous air quality studies, including from CARB, California Air Quality Resource Board, have named submicron-sized particulates as being particularly harmful for human respiration. Through all the discussions today, I have not heard any mention of this fallout, and has this been studied, and also the effects of a highly reactive metal like aluminum on toxifying soils and waters?
The question is, what would be the effects of these materials on human health if they came down into the stratosphere, in particular small particles in aluminum?
So the collaborators of mine working on the aerosol scheme are actually folks from Carnegie Mellon who focused on human health impacts. And while we haven't published it, that was the very first thing we did, was do the order of magnitude calculation in level pencil and paper, but with an expert on human health impacts about whether there could be an issue. And for aluminum or other particles, there are a lot of toxicological things that need to get looked at seriously. But if you're just thinking about the sheer number of particles and the human health impact of small particles, the answer is, well, we haven't published it. That was the first thing we looked at, was some of the leading experts who do epidemiological research on human health impacts, and it's not even close to being an issue.
Clarify, so 10 megatons of aluminum dumped into the atmosphere would have no human health impact. So
let me be more careful here. We're to separate out the toxicological. So the alumina, we've only begun to research and published nothing. Alumina, we've only begun to research and published nothing.
Dane looked at him and he said, so you're telling me that spraying 10 to 20 megatons of aluminum, as you said, would have no human health effects? He took a deep breath and he swallowed and he said, let me be more careful here.
We haven't done anything serious on alumina, and so there could be something terrible that we'll find tomorrow we haven't looked at. You've all seen lots of articles on climate change, and here's yet another New York Times article, just like every other darn one you've seen. It says all the same stuff as all the other ones you've seen. It even has the same kind of headline as all the other ones you've seen. What's unusual about this one maybe is that it's from 1953. And the reason I'm saying this is that you may have the idea this problem is relatively recent, that people have just sort of figured out about it, and now with Kyoto and the Governator and people beginning to actually do something, we may be on the road to solution. The fact is, We've known about this problem for 50 years, depending on how you count it, and we have talked about it endlessly over the last decade or so, and we've accomplished close to zip. This is the growth rate of CO2 in the atmosphere. You've seen this in various forms, but maybe you haven't seen this one. What this shows is that the rate of growth of our emissions is accelerating, and it's accelerating even faster than what we thought was the worst case just a few years back. So that red line there was something that a lot of skeptics said the environmentalists only put in the projections to make the projections look as bad as possible, that emissions would never grow as fast as that red line, but in fact they're growing faster. Here's some data from actually just 10 days ago, which shows this year's minimum of the Arctic sea ice, and it's the lowest by far. And the rate at which the Arctic sea ice is going away is a lot quicker than models. So despite all sorts of experts like me flying around the planet and burning jet fuel, and politicians signing treaties, in fact, you could argue the net effect of all this has been negative because it's just consumed a lot of jet fuel. In terms of what we, in terms of what we really need to do to put the brakes on this very high inertial thing, our big economy, we've really hardly started. Really, we're doing this, basically. Really not very much. I don't want to depress you too much. The problem is absolutely soluble, and even soluble in a way that's reasonably cheap. Cheap meaning sort of the cost of the military, not the cost of medical care. Cheap meaning a few % of GDP. This is really important to have this sense of scale. So the problem is soluble, and the way we should go about solving it is, say, dealing with electricity production, which causes something like 43 or so % in rising of CO2 emissions, and we could do that by perfectly sensible things like conservation and wind power, nuclear power, and coal with CO2 capture, which are all things that are ready for giant scale deployment and work. And all we lack is the action to actually spend the money to put those into place. Instead, we spend our time talking. But nevertheless, that's not what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight is stuff that we might do if we did nothing. And it's this stuff in the middle here, which is what you do if you don't stop the emissions quickly enough, and you need to somehow break the link between human actions that change climate and the climate change itself. And that's particularly important because, of course, while we can adapt to climate change, and it's important to be honest here, there will be some benefits to climate change. Oh, yes, I think it's bad. I spend my whole life working to stop it. But one of the reasons it's politically hard is there are winners and losers, not all losers. But, of course, the natural world, polar bears, I spent time skiing across the sea ice for weeks at a time in the high Arctic. They will completely lose, and there's no adaptation. So this problem is absolutely soluble. This geoengineering idea in its simplest form is basically the following. You could put fine particles, say sulfuric acid particles, sulfates, into the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, where they'd reflect away sunlight and cool the planet. And I know for certain that that will work. Not that there aren't side effects, but I know for certain it will work. And the reason is it's been done. And it was done not by us, not by me, but by nature. Here's Mount Pinatubo in the early 90s that put a whole bunch of sulfur in the stratosphere with a sort of atomic bomb-like cloud, and the result of that was pretty dramatic. After that and some previous volcanoes we have, you see a quite dramatic cooling of the atmosphere. So this lower bar is the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, and it heats up after these volcanoes. But you'll notice that in the upper bar, which is the lower atmosphere on the surface, it cools down because we've shielded the atmosphere a little bit. There's no big mystery about it. There's lots of mystery in the details, and there's some bad side effects, like it partially destroys the ozone layer, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it clearly cools down. And one other thing, it's fast. It's really important to say. So a bunch of the other things that we ought to do, like slowing emissions, are intrinsically slow because it takes time to build all the hardware we need to reduce emissions. And not only that, when you cut emissions, you don't cut concentrations, because concentrations, the amount of CO2 in the air, is the sum of emissions over time. So you can't step on the brakes very quickly. But if you do this, it's quick. And there are times you might like to do something quick. Another thing you might wonder about is, does it work? Can you shade some sunlight and effectively compensate for the added CO2 and produce a climate sort of back to what it was originally? And the answer seems to be yes. So here's the graphs you've seen lots of times before. That's what the world looks like under one particular climate model's view, with twice the amount of CO2 in the air. The lower graph is with twice the amount of CO2 and 1.8% less sunlight, and you're back to the original climate. And this graph from Ken Caldera, it's important to say, came because Ken, at a meeting that I believe Marty Hoffert was also at in the mid-90s, Ken and I stood up at the back of the meeting and said, geoengineering won't work, and to the person who was promoting it said, the atmosphere is much more complicated, a bunch of physical reasons why it wouldn't do a very good compensation. Ken went and ran his models and found that it did. This topic is also old. That report that landed in President Johnson's desk when I was 2 years old, 1965, that report, in fact, which had all the modern climate science, the only thing they talked about doing was geoengineering. It didn't even talk about cutting emissions, which is an incredible shift in our thinking about this problem. I'm not saying we shouldn't cut emissions, we should, but it made exactly this point. So in a sense, there's not much new. The one new thing is this essay. So I should say, I guess, that since the time of that original President Johnson report and the various reports of the U.S. National Academy, 1977, 1982, 1990, people always talked about this idea, not as something that was foolproof, but as an idea to think about. But when climate became politically a hot topic, if I may make the pun, in the last 15 years, this became so un-PC we couldn't talk about it.
Now, what you just heard was David Keith, and then again David Keith, but he was on a TED Talk 9 years ago talking about this. And now, we no longer even have a sun. We no longer can enjoy the sunset because the sun is blotted out by thick clouds at all times that show up in long straight lines like this that remain in the atmosphere. They actually spread out as opposed to dissipating, and they combine with each other to form a large synthetic web or a shade in front of the sun, much like David Keith was talking about. So that kind of throws your evidence not being there out the window now, doesn't it? As far as scientific testing of rainfall and other things like that, well, I'll show you one of many where barium, aluminum, and strontium regularly show up in places like Mount Shasta, where there is no natural occurrence of it whatsoever.